In 1942, Major Sydney Radley-Walters had never seen a tank. 2 years later, he would become the most successful Western Allied tank ace of World War II. While German Panzer crews trained for years in real combat, Radley-Walters learned armored warfare from manuals, improvised training, and battlefield instinct. Allied commanders doubted him. The enemy underestimated him, yet in Normandy, Belgium, and inside Germany itself, his Sherman tank destroyed Panthers and Tigers that should have killed him first. This is not a story about superior machines. It is a story about adaptation, leadership, and survival when doctrine failed and judgment decided everything.
In every great event, there's always a secret they never told you. Hidden behind old maps, silent wars, and forgotten names. The truth is buried, waiting to be revealed. History isn't always what you were taught. Many secrets were hidden, erased, or rewritten. Behind every page, there's a truth waiting to be uncovered. Listen carefully. Welcome to Confidential Facts. Here, hidden history is revealed. Forgotten battles, secret alliances, and untold stories.
Before 1942, the Canadian Army was dangerously unprepared for modern armored warfare, a reality often softened or omitted in popular World War II narratives. Canada possessed neither a mature tank doctrine nor a professional armored officer corps. Most of its soldiers, including Sydney Radley-Walters, had never seen a tank in person. Internal memoranda from Canadian headquarters reveal a quiet crisis of confidence. Mechanized warfare was understood theoretically, but not culturally. Training relied almost entirely on British manuals, many written before combat realities in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union had fundamentally reshaped armored tactics. Officers were taught armored maneuvers in classrooms, using chalk diagrams, wooden models, and verbal descriptions, often without engines, turrets, radios, or live gunnery available. Radley-Walters, originally an infantry officer educated at the Royal Military College of Canada, absorbed this knowledge with skepticism rather than reverence. What few people know is that even within the Canadian Army, many officers privately acknowledged that the manuals were already obsolete by the time they arrived. Lagging months behind German battlefield innovation, Radley-Walters began quietly supplementing official doctrine with translated intelligence summaries, fragmented reports from British veterans of North Africa, and rare glimpses of captured German training materials. This habit-learning intent, rather than memorizing procedure, would later define his success. When the Sherbrooke Fusiliers converted from infantry to armor in early 1942, the transition was chaotic. Sherman tanks arrived late, often incomplete, sometimes without radios or optics, and maintenance logs show that some training vehicles were stripped for parts before crews ever trained on them. In response, Radley-Walters emphasized communication drills over firepower, ordering crews to rehearse engagements verbally, calling out imaginary targets, and practicing timing without firing a single round. This approach was unconventional and quietly mocked, yet it forged a level of crew coordination that most Allied tank units would not achieve until much later in the war. As an infantryman turned tanker, Radley-Walters retained a mindset fundamentally different from career armor officers. He thought in terms of terrain, concealment, and movement under observation, rather than armor thickness and gun penetration tables. While stationed in England prior to D-Day, he personally walked mock Norman hedgerow terrain, timing how long it took tanks to reverse blindly, and noting how visibility collapsed at close range details rarely emphasized in Allied armored training. Meanwhile, skepticism from Allied command persisted. Internal assessments described Canadian armored units as enthusiastic but inexperienced, with some British officers privately predicting severe losses once they encountered Panthers and Tigers. Radley-Walters was acutely aware of this doubt, and it shaped his command philosophy. Crew survival mattered more than doctrinal purity. On June 6, 1944, while not landing under direct fire, he absorbed fragmented radio reports of chaos and uncertainty, noting how German units struggled to coordinate under Allied air superiority. Instead of rushing forward, he focused obsessively on readiness and gents, warmed radios checked, crews fadan, unglamorous discipline that would soon prove decisive. At first light on June 7th, Radley-Walters positioned his Sherman Caribou near the hedgerows south of the beaches. deliberately violating manual recommendations by operating at close range in restrictive terrain. His intent, rarely articulated in official reports, was psychological as much as tactical, forced German armor to commit before revealing his own positions. German doctrine favored long-range ambushes, but the Norman boucage denied visibility and compressed reaction time. When German tanks finally appeared, Radley-Walters did not fire immediately. He waited, understanding that the opening seconds of contact shaped morale. Shermans emerging unexpectedly from hedgerows at oblique angles shattered German expectations, creating confusion disproportionate to the actual number of Allied tanks present. Post-war interviews and after-action reports reveal another overlooked factor. Radley-Walters repeatedly exposed himself to observe the battlefield directly, not out of recklessness, but because he believed commanders needed shared perception with their crews. This presence accelerated decision-making and built trust, while many German commanders remained isolated inside buttoned-up turrets, slower to react. By nightfall on June 7th, Radley-Walters understood something that doctrine had failed to teach. Experience alone did not determine battlefield superiority, adaptability did. His squadron had survived its first real test against veteran German armor, not through superior firepower, but by thinking differently, moving unpredictably, and leading decisively. The manuals had not been useless, but they had been incomplete, and Radley-Walters had learned it before most. Allied commanders, that survival and victory depended on knowing when to abandon them. If you want to continue this story into the moment where Shermans begin destroying Panthers and Tigers against all expectations, stay with this channel, because the next story reveals how Radley-Walters turned these lessons into lethal reality. By the second week of the Normandy campaign, the reality of armored warfare bore little resemblance to what Allied planners had anticipated. And Major Sydney Radley-Walters was already adapting faster than most commanders around him. German counterattacks were no longer improvised reactions, but deliberate attempts to exploit the boucage, where narrow lanes, sunken roads, and thick hedgerows erased the Sherman's numerical advantage and magnified its technical inferiority. What is rarely discussed in official histories is how quickly German Panther units learned to dominate predictable Allied movements, setting up kill zones where a single well-positioned 75mm gun could destroy multiple Shermans before being detected. Canadian armored losses in early July quietly alarmed higher command, though public reports remained optimistic. Radley-Walters, now commanding a squadron of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, noticed a pattern that others dismissed as bad luck. German tanks were not superior everywhere, only where they were allowed to dictate the terms of engagement. Drawing on his infantry instincts, he began treating Panther and Tiger tanks as mobile strongpoints rather than dueling opponents. Instead of advancing along obvious roads, he maneuvered through fields deemed impassable by doctrine, pushing Shermans through hedgerows at short range where German optics and long-barreled guns became liabilities rather than advantages. One little-known detail preserved in Canadian after-action annotations is that Radley-Walters routinely ordered his tanks to halt engines after repositioning, allowing the sound of German engines to reveal their presence first. In the claustrophobic Norman countryside, sound often betrayed armor before sight, a factor largely ignored in Allied manuals. When contact was made, Radley-Walters emphasized rapid, coordinated flanking rather than individual marksmanship. Crews were instructed not to fixate on killing the enemy tank immediately, but to force it to rotate its turret, exposing thinner side armor to another Sherman positioned at a different angle. This technique, later referred to informally among Canadian crews as cross-pressure, was not taught in Allied schools, but evolved organically under Radley-Walters' leadership. German crews, trained for disciplined frontal engagements, often hesitated when faced with multiple threats emerging from unexpected directions at close range. By mid-July, Radley-Walters had already participated in the destruction of several Panthers, though official tallies lagged behind reality due to the chaos of battlefield confirmation. What few people know is that Radley-Walters discouraged celebration or discussion of kills within his squadron, believing that fixation on victories bred complacency. Instead, he conducted quiet, methodical debriefs focused on what had nearly gone wrong. His concern was justified. Panthers still outgunned Shermans, and a single mistake could annihilate an entire crew in seconds. During one engagement near Caen, Radley-Walters narrowly avoided death when a Panther round passed through hedgerow foliage and struck the ground inches from Caribou's hull, the blast showering the turret with earth and metal fragments. Rather than withdraw, he repositioned immediately, exploiting the German tank's momentary disorientation to direct another Sherman into its blind side. These moments forged his growing reputation, not as a reckless ace, but as a commander who survived battles that should have killed him. As the campaign dragged into August, Radley-Walters' methods began spreading quietly through neighboring Canadian units. Tank crews compared notes informally at night, exchanging insights that never reached official doctrine. German reports from the same period reveal mounting frustration, noting that Canadian armor behaved unpredictably and refused to engage at expected distances. This was not coincidence. It was Radley-Walters' philosophy taking root. By the time Allied forces broke out of Normandy, he had destroyed or assisted in the destruction of multiple Panthers, and at least one Tiger, though exact numbers remain debated due to overlapping claims. What is beyond dispute is that his leadership drastically reduced losses within his squadron compared to comparable units. Operating under stricter doctrinal control, Radley-Walters understood something few tank commanders grasped in 1944. Armor combat was no longer about machines alone, but about decision speed, crew trust, and the courage to discard instructions written for a battlefield that no longer existed. As Allied forces pushed toward the Seine, German armor began retreating, but the danger did not diminish. Instead, it transformed into ambushes by desperate, highly skilled crews determined to slow the advance at any cost. Radley-Walters knew the hardest fighting was still ahead, and that every lesson learned in Normandy would soon be tested again against an enemy that was adapting just as ruthlessly. If you want to see how these hard-earned tactics carried, Radley-Walters through Belgium and into Germany, where his reputation as the top Western Allied tank ace was finally sealed. Stay with this channel, because the next story takes the fight beyond Normandy and into the heart of collapsing German resistance. As Allied forces surged out of Normandy and advanced rapidly through northern France into Belgium, Major Sydney Radley-Walters entered the most dangerous phase of his war, not because German armor was stronger, but because it was increasingly desperate, fragmented, and unpredictable. This phase of the campaign is often portrayed as a headlong Allied rush. Yet confidential Canadian operational logs tell a different story. German Panzer units, though depleted, fought with a lethal efficiency born of experience and fatalism. Retreating German crews no longer adhered strictly to doctrine. They ambushed, concealed, and waited patiently for opportunities to destroy Allied armor at close range. Radley-Walters recognized this shift almost immediately. What few people realize is that by late August 1944, he began deliberately slowing his squadron's advance, even as higher headquarters urged speed, understanding that pursuit could easily turn into slaughter if discipline collapsed. His philosophy of crew survival deepened during this period. He rotated crews more aggressively than was common, pulling experienced men out of the line temporarily to prevent exhaustion-induced mistakes, a practice that quietly contradicted Allied norms but dramatically reduced fatal errors. In Belgium, the terrain changed. An open farmland, villages with stone buildings, narrow bridges, all of which altered the balance between Sherman mobility and German ambush potential. Radley-Walters adjusted by emphasizing overwatch and staggered movement, ensuring that no tank advanced without another positioned to engage a hidden threat. German after-action fragments from this period reveal growing confusion, noting that Canadian armor no longer advanced in predictable columns but appeared in dispersed, mutually supporting groups that were difficult to isolate. One little-known engagement near the Belgian border illustrates Radley-Walters' evolving command style. When a German Panther destroyed a lead Sherman with a single shot, Radley-Walters ordered an immediate withdrawal rather than counterattack, a decision that frustrated nearby Allied officers but ultimately saved multiple crews from a concealed second Panther positioned for a follow-up kill. Only after repositioning did his squadron return, flanking and destroying both German tanks without loss. These moments underscore a critical but rarely emphasized truth: Radley-Walters' growing kill count was inseparable from his restraint. He did not pursue destruction for its own sake. He pursued survival through control. By the time Allied forces approached the German frontier, Radley-Walters' reputation had spread informally beyond Canadian units. American and British crews began observing Canadian maneuvers more closely, quietly incorporating similar tactics without official endorsement. Radley-Walters himself remained intensely private, avoiding attention and discouraging discussion of his personal tally. Yet internal Canadian correspondence increasingly cited his squadron as a benchmark for effective armored leadership. The psychological burden of command also intensified. Unlike earlier phases of the war, Radley-Walters now carried the knowledge that every decision advance, halt, withdrawalment, life or death for men who trusted him completely. Post-war reflections suggest this weight never left him. He spoke rarely of heroism and often of responsibility. As Allied armor crossed into Germany itself, the enemy's resistance hardened in places and collapsed in others, creating a battlefield defined by sudden violence amid apparent calm. Radley-Walters anticipated that the most dangerous enemy was no longer the veteran Panzer crew, but the isolated, determined tank commander willing to fight to the end. He adapted again, tightening control, emphasizing reconnaissance, and reminding his crews constantly that the war was not over simply because victory seemed inevitable. By early 1945, his methods had become instinctive to those who served under him, shaping a generation of Canadian armored soldiers who had learned warfare not from manuals, but from survival. If you want to see how Radley-Walters faced the final brutal phase of the war, inside Germany itself, where every engagement carried the weight of impending victory and meaningless death stay. With this channel, because the next story brings thee into the heart of the Reich. By the time Major Sydney Radley-Walters and his squadron crossed into Germany in early 1945, the war had entered its most psychologically complex phase, where the certainty of Allied victory coexisted with some of the war's deadliest and most pointless violence. Contrary to post-war imagery of a collapsing enemy, German resistance inside the Reich was uneven but often ferocious, driven not by coherent strategy but by localized determination, fear of retribution, and a sense among many tank crews that survival lay in fighting on their own terms rather than surrendering. Radley-Walters recognized immediately that German armor, though scarce, had become more dangerous precisely because it was no longer bound by broader operational logic. Isolated Panthers and assault guns appeared suddenly, striking from concealment and disappearing just as quickly, often commanded by officers with nothing left to lose. What few people know is that Allied intelligence assessments during this period were frequently unreliable. German units were misidentified, strength estimates fluctuated wildly, and terrain familiarity increasingly favored defenders. Radley-Walters compensated by tightening his command style even further, insisting on reconnaissance before every movement and discouraging the assumption that the enemy was finished. In internal Canadian notes, his squadron is repeatedly described as methodical to the point of impatience, yet their casualty rate remained notably lower than comparable units advancing at similar speed. Radley-Walters also refined his approach to urban combat, a domain where tanks were particularly vulnerable. He avoided entering towns blindly, preferring to isolate them, probe for resistance, and withdraw rather than force entry if conditions were unfavorable. This caution frustrated higher headquarters eager to maintain momentum. But Radley-Walters understood that a single concealed anti-tank weapon could negate months of survival in seconds. One lesser-known engagement near the Rhine illustrates this philosophy vividly. When German armor was reported withdrawing through a village, Radley-Walters refused pursuit, suspecting a trap. Subsequent reconnaissance revealed pre-sighted firing positions covering the main road positions that would have devastated his lead troop had he advanced. As German resistance continued to fragment, the moral weight of command deepened. Radley-Walters increasingly faced not elite Panzer crews, but hastily assembled formations, sometimes manned by teenagers or exhausted veterans drawn from shattered units. He did not romanticize these encounters. Post-war accounts suggest he found them unsettling rather than triumphant. Yet danger remained absolute. In several late-war engagements, German tanks fought with precision and patience, exploiting the Allies' expectation of collapse. Radley-Walters responded by reinforcing discipline, reminding his crews that complacency was now the greatest threat. His kill tally continued to grow during this period, though documentation became even more fragmented amid the chaos of final operations. What is clear from surviving records is that his leadership philosophy prioritizing crew survival, flexibility, and initiative had become second nature not only to his squadron, but to many Canadian armored units operating nearby. As Allied forces converged on the heart of Germany, Radley-Walters no longer fought to prove doctrine wrong. He fought to bring his men home alive. The irony of his journey was complete. An officer who had once learned armored warfare from manuals alone had become a quiet authority on how wars actually end. Not with glory, but with vigilance maintained until the very last shot. If you want to understand how Radley-Walters' wartime philosophy shaped his legacy after the guns fell silent, then why his story still matters today. Stay with this channel because the last story reveals the lasting impact of a commander who redefined Allied armored leadership. The war in Europe finally ended. Major Sydney Radley-Walters emerged not as a public hero or celebrated symbol of Allied armored power, but as a quiet anomaly within military history and infantry officer turned tanker who had become the most successful Western Allied tank ace without ever embracing the mythology of the role. In the immediate aftermath of victory, official Allied narratives emphasized industrial strength, overwhelming numbers, and technological progress, leaving little room for individual adaptation or doctrinal dissent. As a result, Radley-Walters' contributions were recognized within military circles, but rarely explained in depth to the public. What few people know is that Canadian post-war armored assessments quietly referenced his squadron's operational behavior as a model for future training, particularly regarding decentralized command and crew-level initiative. Yet these lessons were absorbed indirectly, filtered through institutional language that stripped away their improvised origins. Radley-Walters himself resisted efforts to frame his wartime record as exceptional. In private correspondence and later interviews, he consistently redirected attention to his crews, emphasizing that survival, not destruction, had been his primary measure of success. This perspective ran counter to prevailing post-war narratives that equated victory with enemy kills rather than lives preserved. As NATO forces reorganized during the early Cold War, many of the principles Radley-Walters had developed under fire mobility over armor thickness, adaptability over rigid doctrine, leadership presence over centralized control emerged in formalized armored doctrine, often without attribution. The irony is striking. Ideas born from an undertrained, under-equipped Canadian unit became embedded in the professional armies of the post-war world. Radley-Walters returned to civilian life carrying the invisible weight common to many combat leaders, memories of decisions that could not be undone, and lives that had depended on moments of judgment measured in seconds. He spoke rarely of combat and never sought to shape his own legend, a silence that contributed to his relative obscurity outside specialist circles. Yet, among historians who study armored warfare closely, his record remains deeply instructive. He demonstrated that technological inferiority does not predetermine defeat. That experience can become a liability when it calcifies into expectation, and that leadership rooted in understanding rather than bravado can change the outcome of battles and wars. Perhaps the most confidential and overlooked aspect of Radley-Walters' legacy is not the number of German tanks he destroyed, but the number of Canadian crews who survived because he refused to treat doctrine as dogma. In an era defined by machines, he proved that human judgment remained decisive. His story endures not because it defies statistics, but because it exposes a deeper truth about warfare. Those who learn fastest, adapt most honestly, and lead most responsibly shape history in ways that numbers alone can never explain. If you value stories that reveal how wars are truly fought beyond myths, beyond machines, and beyond simplified heroic support, this channel, stay subscribed, and continue exploring the overlooked truths of World War II history.
Bringing men home mattered more than destroying